Вмикаю мікрофон, вмикаю відео, так?
Да. James Sherr, who is has done the tour as one of the finest analysts in Europe on Eastern Europe, has done his tour at the Oxfords and the Sandhursts and the Chatham houses, and is in fact safely ensconced now somewhere in Estonia on the front line, gathering all that information that we need in the West to know what to do. So, James, I'm going to leave it to you to introduce, to say a few words, and then introduce our featured speaker, the head of RANBO, or the head of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Oleksiy Danilov. Okay, James, it's all yours.
Am I audible?
That's a good question.
Yes. Believing so is not enough. Yes or no?
Keep speaking and I'll tell.
All right. Okay. I think I am now. I feel it now.
Yes,
All right. Thank you very much, Walter. As you know, the organizers, including yourself, have asked me to precede the introduction of our distinguished speaker with 5 minutes of comments of my own. With luck, they will only be 3 minutes. We are restricted to 35 minutes with this panel, but as of now, not as of the program. He who wills the end wills the means. When Russia launched its latest onslaught against Ukraine in 2022, it believed that the West willed neither. The war will not end until Russia's state leadership believes that the West wills both the end and the means. That means understanding that the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine is a war against the West. In Poland, the 3 Baltic states, and in Finland, almost everyone understands that. I was in a session in Rzeszów in Poland where someone questioned the wisdom of Poland parting with so much of its armored infantry for the Ukrainian armed forces. And I was not the only one who said, you must understand, Poland is not supporting Ukraine. Poland is defending Poland in Ukraine. This is a major difference in understanding between different parts of Europe about the nature of this war. But how many in Washington understand that Russia is waging war against the United States? How many understand that the 0.21% of GDP that the US has spent on military support to Ukraine this past year is less than what it spent per annum in its war in Afghanistan, that it amounts to 1/3 the sums dispensed on the war in Iraq, 1/13 of the expenditure of the war in Korea, and 1/15 the volume and the financial magnitude of lend-lease assistance to the UK during the last war. How many understand that if the West lacks the will and the means to defeat the adversary we can and must defeat today, namely Russia, the Chinese are most unlikely to believe that we will have the will and the means to defeat them tomorrow? How many understand, as Stephen Blank said in the last panel, that Russia has never honored any agreement it has made with Ukraine. It has violated 8 of them. It has never anywhere returned any territory it has acquired on any basis to its original jurisdictions. And therefore, how many understand that a war with Russia that ends a negotiation is a war that never ends? In Ukraine, there is an axiom. Ukrainians have no fear that Ukraine will stop fighting. Our fear is that the West will make us stop fighting. As long as these questions are not understood and they are not convincingly answered in the West, that fear in Ukraine will remain. Now, since the appointment of its first secretary, that most astute and far-sighted gentleman, Vladimir Pavlovich Karpulin, in August 1994, the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine has been charged with coordinating the implementation of the security and defense policies of the state. Who, therefore, is more fitting to address us at this point in our proceedings than Oleksiy Danilov, who from July 2019 in July 2019 was appointed Deputy Secretary of the RNBO and subsequently the Secretary. In other words, he has been the wartime Secretary since 2022 of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. He will speak through simultaneous translation, which appears to be up and running very well. Sir, you are welcome. It is an honor to have you, and the floor is now yours.
Дякую, колега. Дякую за те, що завітали поділитися думками стосовно подій, які відбуваються зараз на території нашої країни і в світі. Хочу сказати, що коли мова йде про свою боротьбу, як тут написано, я з цим не можу погодитись, тому що це не тільки наша боротьба, це спільна боротьба всіх країн, які приймають в цьому участь. І я можу сказати, що ми свідомі того, за що ми боремося, розуміємо, яка це буде боротьба. І тут би хотіли звернути увагу на такі речі, як фундаментальні цінності, які мають бути недоторканими в цивілізованому світі. Мова йде, перш за все, про людину. І якщо ми кажемо, що людина має бути тим творінням, яке Господь сюди відправив на цю землю, і ніхто не має права лишати її життя, то, на превеликий жаль, в 21 сторіччі ми стикнулися з сучасною чумою, яку можна порівняти з фашистською Німеччиною в 20 сторіччі, яка є поруч з нами, яка майже кожного дня, на превеликий жаль, вбиває наших дітей, жінок, літніх людей. І це є речі, які є абсолютно неприпустимими. І наша спільна боротьба з нашими друзями, вона обов'язково закінчиться перемогою. Питання тільки часу. І, на превеликий жаль, той ціни, який має сплатити наш народ за нашу свободу, за нашу незалежність, В 21 сторіччі це речі є абсолютно неприпустимими, те, що відбувається, але, на жаль, ми маємо сьогодні наслідки поведінки певної частини Заходу по відношенню до Росії. І з урахуванням кволої реакції багатьох країн Заходу на ті події, які почали активно відбуватися з 2008 року, починаючи з Грузії, маємо сьогодні такі наслідки. Я більш ніж впевнений, що перемога буде за нами. Інша справа, що це буде за перемога, коли вона настане і що буде після цієї перемоги. Це дуже важлива річ. Я вважаю, що на сьогодні Захід не усвідомлює процесів, які розпочалися на Росії. Розуміння фрагментації Росії для нас цілком зрозуміло, і ми розуміємо, що цей процес має початися найближчим часом. І Захід має бути готовий до цього процесу. Маємо бути свідомі, що в тому вигляді, в якому зараз існує Росія, вона найближчим часом припинить своє існування. І якщо хтось вважає, що це можна в якийсь спосіб контролювати або робити якусь модерацію цього процесу, то це велика помилка. Є процеси, які не залежать від Заходу, і на сьогоднішній день вже не залежать від нашої країни. Це процеси почав Путін 24 лютого 2022 року. Це не тільки напад на нашу країну, це і початок руйнації Росії. Це тож обов'язково найближчі 3, 5, 7 років будемо ми з вами спільно спостерігати. І до цього треба готуватися. Готуватися всім, тому що ми будемо бачити нову мапу на території, яку на сьогоднішній день займає сучасна Росія. Звичайно, ми не самотні в цьому світі, і ті країни-партнери, перш за все, Сполучені Штати, Великобританія, поляки, країни Балтії, Канада, інші країни, вони допомагають не тільки нам, вони допомагають всьому цивілізованому світу. І я ще раз наголошую, ми розуміємо, що перемога буде за нами, і та імперія, яка мала би існувати, час її прийшов кінця. Так відбувалося в сучасній історії з усіма імперіями. Рано чи пізно вони помирали. Так само зараз ми будемо з вами спостерігати процес, коли Росія як імперія помре найближчим часом.
Thank you very much. Do I have my microphone back? Yes. I have to say for comments of that length, you omitted absolutely nothing and you said everything. Secretary Danilov, thank you very much. I think we'll have time for 3 questions. I can't resist making just one point, which is consistent with what you have said, that this war will have a profound impact on Russia. But for good and ill, the preoccupation to this day of most Western governments is not Ukraine, it's Russia. And there needs to be an understanding, in my view, that what happens inside Russia is a vital interest for people who live there. Our vital interest is to ensure that whatever happens there, our allies and our partners are defended and secure, and that Ukraine become an ally and not simply a partner, de jure and not only de facto, as quickly as possible. And until Ukraine is made secure and becomes an ally equal to all others, this war will not end. Questions? I think we have time, Walter, we have time for 2 or 3. Adrian,
Can I ask a question about the secretary's?
we need a microphone.
Can I ask about the Secretary's interpretation and assessment of the Chinese negotiation stance, and in particular, what weight does he give to the first clause of China's position? What weight does he give to the first clause in the proposed set of measures to bring about an end to the war? That is the understanding that everything operates within the context of the full territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine.
Ну, перш за все, я хочу сказати, що після цієї війни буде зовсім інший розклад на території бившого пострадянського простору. Ця війна – це остаточний розпад СРСР. От, всі країни, які входять в так зване УДКБ, от, які раніше співпрацювали з Росією, припинять з нею спілкування і співпрацю в тому вигляді, в якому вони на сьогоднішній день до 24 лютого співпрацювали. Відповідно, поруч знаходиться Китай, от, який так само буде дуже уважно спостерігати за процесами, які будуть відбуватися. Вони майже вперше от зараз висловили свою публічну позицію відносно ситуації, пов'язаної з війною от, на території нашої країни. Ви знаєте, їх пропозиція нібито миру, хоча там немає чіткого тлумачення, що ж таке Росія і чому вона розпочала цю війну. Там більше загальних фраз от, в цій їх пропозиції. Але я більш ніж впевнений, що западний світ розуміє всю проблематику, яка є з урахуванням ситуації слабкості Росії от, і присутності поруч Китая. Він, звичайно, буде намагатися скористуватися певними моментами от, і на Далекому Сході Росії, і в Казахстані тощо. І тут треба дуже уважно слідкувати за всіми процесами, які будуть відбуватися найближчим часом.
Катерина.
Thank you. I have a question to Mr. Danilov with regard to this particular point about insufficient understanding of Russia's weakness in the West. And my question is, yes, the Ukraine's view, the Central East European view is in such a so-called epistemological hierarchy is not as valid as those views or let's say big powers and even Russia, which is imposing its perspective. And so my question is, what are the most solid arguments you would come up with, maybe 1 or 2, to provide evidence to the point that Russia is fragmenting and is going to fragment further into the full dissolution of the empire? Thank you.
Ну, перше за все, я хочу всім нам нагадати, що перед 24 лютого 2022 року в світі не було жодної розвідки, в світі не було жодного керівництва будь-якої країни, які давали нам шанс взагалі утримати ситуацію під контролем. От, всі вважали, що ми приречені на поразку, тому що оцінка Росії свого часу вона була абсолютно хибною, от, і всі вважали, що Росія – це могутня країна, яка спроможна вирішити питання з нашої країни за лічені дні. От. 3, 5, 7 днів нам давали на те, що ми будемо існувати. От. Ми були свідомі того, що це абсолютно не відповідає дійсності, що це буде зовсім навпаки, але на превеликий жаль, жодна, ще раз наголошую, жодна країна цивілізованого світу і не тільки нам не вірила. Тому що прогнози, які роблять багато країн, багато розвиток, багато аналітичних центрів, вони будуються на трошечки хибних первинних даних, от, які дають потім оці зовсім некоректні висновки, на яких базуються ті чи інші рішення. Я можу нагадати, 2 березня 1989 року от, розпочався фактично перший крок для розпаду СРСР. Це була перша стачка в місті Воркута, коли шахтарі почали страйк, який був, якщо ви пам'ятаєте, в Радянському Союзі взагалі заборонений. Це був початок розпаду Радянського Союзу, саме 2 березня 1989 року. Так оце 2 березня 1989 року в Росії відбулося 24 лютого 2022 року, коли божевільний Путін дав вказівку почати війну проти нашої Росії. На Росії вже зараз відбувається дуже багато процесів, на яких мало хто звертає увагу, а вони варті того, щоб за ними дуже уважно слідкувати. І коли 2 дні Путін потім сказав, що є інші народи, він навіть назвав московіти, він навіть назвав інші народи, які є на території Росії, чого до цього часу ніколи в житті не було. Вони всіх вважали росіянами. От. Ми набагато більше володіємо інформацією, що ж там відбувається. І повірте, розпад Росії в 3, 5, 7 років обов'язково відбудеться. Питання тільки наскільки частин, і хто буде це підхоплювати, і хто буде на території цих країн займатися побудовою нових країн. Ічкерія буде вільна, Дагестан буде вільний, Татарстан буде вільний, і я ще можу назвати щонайменше 3, 4, 5 територій, які будуть мати свої кордони, свою владу, своїх президентів і свої парламенти. І так відбудеться. Це зупинити неможливо. Це все працює по зовсім інших законах.
Howard Altman, please.
The microphone so you can hear it.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Howard Altman from the War Zone. Thank you very much for taking time. Can you tell me do you know if China is going to provide arms to Ukraine, to Russia, and if so, what kind? And then can you tell me the status of Iran's plan to send short-range ballistic missiles like the Fatah 110 and the Zolfajar? Thank you.
Я не можу сьогодні сказати, що Китай наважиться надавати зброю Росії. Для Китаю це дуже ризикована ситуація. Більш того, я не бачу ніяких причин, щоб Китай допомагав Росії. Свого часу, коли перед початком війни, звичайно, Путін довів до керівництва Китаю, що він буде так працювати, і він обіцяв, що він дуже в короткий проміжок часу закінчить цю війну. І якщо б це відбулося, Китай би мав зовсім іншу поведінку. Зараз Китай буде спостерігати за процесами. Ще раз наголошую, ми не розуміємо, для чого Китаю сьогодні допомагати Росії. Інша справа – Іран. Там ситуація набагато гірша, ніж в Китаї. Вони є сьогодні країною, яка одна із небагатьох допомагає Росії. боротися з нашою країною. Є чітке розуміння, що ці шахеди, які інколи залітають на нашу територію, це саме шахеди, які виробляються в Ірані. Іде зараз велика розмова Росії з Іраном, на що вони там хочуть мінятися, ми з вами можемо чітко усвідомлювати, що Іран має велике бажання остаточно вирішити питання наявності в себе ядерного озброєння, і це виклик не тільки для нашої країни, це виклик для всіх сусідів, які поруч з Іраном. Уявляйте собі, якщо ця країна буде мати ядерну зброю.
We actually have 5 or 6 minutes remaining. So, and believe it or not, you might be happy or pained to know that I have 2 other very brief comments to make, but let's take one more question from the audience first. Walter. Right, and you have priority.
No, I actually like my microphone. Пане Oleksiy, дякую, що ви прибули до нас. I have a question, and that question has to deal with what we've been discussing over time in terms of the Black Sea. We've mentioned China as a key player in all of this. Where do you see Turkey?
Good question.
So I think that's important for us to understand, or the Black Sea especially.
Дякую. Хотів би зауважити, що у нас не 5-6 хвилин, у нас попереду ще велике життя і дуже-дуже багато роботи після війни по відновленню нашої країни, по розбудові нашої країни, і це для нас буде окремим викликом і окремим буде завданням для всього нашого народу. Те, що стосується Чорного моря і Туреччини, я хочу вам нагадати 2 речі. Перш за все, в вересні 2021 року в Чорному морі відбувалися великі навчання, морські навчання, вони мали назву Сібріз-21. Так ось, під час цих навчань британський корабель під назвою Defender пішов прямо, куди він вважав за необхідне, в ті води, які росіяни вважали своїми. Я можу сказати, що цей Defender обов'язково буде знаходитися в Чорному морі, і не тільки він, і Чорне море – це буде базою для кораблів НАТО. Ми в цьому більш ніж впевнені. Те, що стосується Туреччини, ви знаєте, що в всій демократичній країні найближчим часом будуть відбуватися демократичні вибори президента країни. В залежності від того, як буде ця демократія там розвиватися, ми будемо мати з вами відповідь на багато питань найближчі 5, 7, 10 років, те, що стосується Туреччини.
How frustrating that you and us and you and I are not able to continue this discussion for another hour. We easily could. Dare I say about China that when this war started, China took for granted that however junior and subordinate to itself Russia would be, it counted on Russia remaining a stable global great power, and it needed this in order to distract and tie down the United States. And therefore, I think we need to understand that if this war ends as it should end, the consequences will be very significant for China as well as for Russia. I am being told we must stop. I am confident, I hope I can be confident, this is not our last conversation individually or collectively. thank you very much, not only for the clarity of what you said and the insight, but for the fact that, as we would expect, you made all of these points in a highly authoritative way, and we will reflect upon them. Thank you again for joining us.
Дякую.
Андрей? Okay.
James, that was wonderful. And I really thank you for having started the afternoon that way. And two enormously powerful authorities really did. They were so effective that very few questions emerged as a result. Thank you very much. Thank you once again. And now, as I had promised, we had three very important morning sessions on land, sea, and air issues. In the afternoon, we are going to have the questions that sometimes happen to be more complicated, and those are the cyber and informational warfare, the hybrid warfare capabilities, the use of economic warfare, that is natural resources, and just the destruction of the infrastructure of Ukraine and what that can do to Ukraine. And then finally, just generally, the energy question, as it always has been. It seems to have haunted Ukraine since its independence. So with that, I have Ambassador Courtney. As I said, I'm going to be inviting Ambassador Courtney. I'm asking Mr. Oleksandr Danilov. I think he's on the screen already. Danylyuk is on screen, and it's Oleksandr V. Danylyuk. And I should have made that designation, because there are two rather important Oleksandr Danylyuks in Ukraine. Then there's Brian Mefford. Brian, are you here? And then Mr. John Costello. Okay, Mr. Costello, is he here? Okay, I'll have to make sure. I think he may have thought that it was. What time is it now? We're right on time. Well, he's not right on time. So, but we do have three, so we'll work with those. We have the special discussant. Actually, he actually does have the last word. So, with that, I just simply wanted to say, in introducing Ambassador Bill Courtney, you've seen Ambassador Herbst, you've seen Ambassador Taylor in his time at many of our conferences. There's also Ambassador Courtney. These are the senior diplomats. These are the wise men. These are the folks that have made American foreign policy what it is in terms of as a global power, and have kept America a global power, because you can see the enormous wisdom in these people. And so with that, I can only say, it's my friend, Ambassador Courtney, Bill Courtney. It's all yours, sir.
Thank you, Walter. So we're going to talk about exploitation of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's our task. And to give a few examples from the past and the current, in World War II, the Allies broke the Enigma code, the Nazi code, and we broke the Japanese naval code, and the British invented radar. All tremendous advances in exploiting the electromagnetic spectrum. During the Cold War, the US and other allies developed spy satellites, which collected signals or electronic information as well as photographic information. And there were facilities around the world to collect electronically information on Soviet missile testing and other activities. And then with the advent of the internet, cybersecurity became a new domain, if you will, of electronic warfare. And then currently in this war, there have been several interesting aspects. Russia launched a cyber attack at the beginning, but it apparently did not turn out to be so successful. And so it hasn't been as important part of the war fight since then. as it was at the beginning. In the sinking of the Moskva, the ship apparently did not have its fire control radars on, and the Ukrainians may have used some deception to encourage its other radars to look in the opposite direction from that from which the Neptune anti-ship missiles sank the ship. There's been liberal use of jamming against drones and jamming of the global positioning system data. So let me just cite those as examples. I have one other, but I can't read my writing. So let's go ahead and start with our speakers. Let me first call on Oleksandr Danylyuk, who served as special advisor to the head of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service and as an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Defense. He currently heads the Center for Defense Reforms and is a coordinator of the NATO-Ukraine Intergovernmental Platform for Early Detection and Countering of Hybrid Threats. Oleksandr, would you like to go ahead?
Mute, unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, sir. How much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Excuse me?
15, 1-5, sorry. Can you say in the microphone how many minutes?
15 minutes.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for very interesting discussions we heard today. And most of all, let me express my gratitude for the support Ukrainians getting from the first of all, people of the United States of America and of course, US government. Thank you very much for that. And honestly, I think that I will use this stage, according to my personal vision of what would be the best way to explain what's going on in Ukraine. And obviously, I will speak a little bit about EW, electronic warfare, cyber warfare as well, but they are not like key areas of our struggle with Russia, and definitely not, the most strategic areas of that confrontation. So, in few words, I think that it's completely clear that Ukraine appear to be much more capable than especially Western and Russian experts and intelligence analysts expected. And Ukraine appeared to be much more resilient and capable, not only in a purely military domain, in which Ukrainian armed forces definitely proved that they were built from the scratch after 2014 and became one of the best armed forces in the world. Not only because of the heroic actions of Ukrainian soldiers and officers, but also because of that enormous technical capabilities developed after 2014. You mentioned, sir, that Russian attempts to use cyber attacks on Ukrainian cyber infrastructure in the beginning of conflict. You're absolutely right. So why Russians failed? From my point of view, it's not because Russians were weak. So Russians failed in cyber domain because Ukrainians were strong. So that was the reason, and I can provide you some data for your better understanding of why Ukraine was so strong in its cyber security. So in Ukraine, there are few of government institutions responsible for cybersecurity. The key institution responsible for that cybersecurity is government service for special information and communication protection. So this is a pretty big agency in which about 8,000 officers, uniformed officers, daily responsible for providing that cyber security for Ukrainian critical infrastructure. It's a huge number of people. There are very few nations in the world who have the same number of people deployed 24/7 in doing the same kind of things. Again, so it's just the key, the most numerous agency, but we also have other institutions in which we have also special units responsible for cyber protection. SBU, our counterintelligence agency, has its cyber security center. National Police as well has National Cyber Police, and obviously all of the intelligence agencies, they also have some cyber capabilities, part of which are at least focused on security of that agencies and their infrastructure. So it was a huge number of pretty well trained professionals who were ready to protect Ukrainian infrastructure. In addition, Ukraine, as I believe a lot of us know, is one of the key IT development countries in the world, and Ukraine has a lot of IT engineers who also joined that cyber security front line in the very first days. So that's why Russians very soon realized that with all of their desire, it wouldn't be possible to destroy Ukrainian cyber infrastructure by cyber offensive means. And that's why they started using missile attacks, so kinetic attacks. And I think that this is very important lesson to be learned. But anyhow, I don't think that cyber domain is the most important domain in which Russia is operating and in which Russia should be defeated. So just a few words, despite it's not about EW and cyber warfare, but I think that this is important, and I think that it's what Ukraine lacks right now, and this is what all of us like, that partnership of Ukraine and NATO, from my point of view, lacks. So I think that actually we are in kind of very interesting situation in which very few people even discuss how that potential Ukrainian victory should look like, and how that Ukrainian victory should be achieved. So somehow, I don't know why, there is very common, from my point of view, wrong opinion that actually Ukraine needs to liberate its own territory, and after that we will achieve a victory. Maybe, in some computer games it would be like that, but in wars it doesn't work like that. So actually we need to understand that wars are over after one of the sides is not able to continue fighting. And it's completely clear that even after the complete liberation of all of the territories of Ukraine, it wouldn't mean that Russia will lose that ability to continue its aggression. And obviously, Ukraine is not going to finish this war by occupation of Russian Federation in Vladivostok, for instance, or in Moscow. So that's why we need to understand that this confrontation we have with Russia is not possible to win only by military means. So we have to understand that this confrontation has three domains. One of them is military domain, in which definitely our strategic goal is to make that unacceptable damage to Russian military capabilities, after which Russia will not have, at least for some time, enough military capabilities to continue attacking us, at least with the same level of intensity. But it's not only about number of Russian troops we have to eliminate, and it's not only about number of Russian weaponry and military equipment we should destroy. It's also about financial, economical ability of Putin's regime to continue supporting this war by building new weaponry, new military equipment, paying salaries to troops, etc., as well as supporting some very basic needs of ridiculous Russian population. And the third domain is psychological domain, which is also very important, because as long as Russians, as people and Russian elites will accept this war and all of the damage which this war will bring not only to Ukraine but to Russia as well, they will continue fighting. So that's why it's completely clear that to make that unacceptable damage in military domain, we need just more weapon for Ukraine, and again more sophisticated weapon, because if we will try to fight Russians in symmetrical way, it means that we will be forced to sacrifice similar number of Ukrainians, and this is not what we actually going to do, because obviously Russia is much bigger country by population and is less sensitive toward sacrificing its people. But anyhow, having that more sophisticated systems, Ukraine definitely can make that unacceptable damage to Russian military capabilities. Domain number two, economic domain. So despite all of the sanctions, like 10 different packages in European Union, at least, it's completely clear that Russia still can generate some income which could be used to support this war. Why? Because the key income Russia has is, which is pretty well known, is from its oil and gas business, mostly oil. That's why it's completely clear that to reduce that income, it should be additional supplies on international market, which could reduce Russian share, as well as reduce price of oil and gas. And in this regard, I want to say that you have your neighbor, Canada, which is definitely capable to increase significantly its own production of oil and gas and change the situation completely. So this is like the shortest way to do that. In addition, OPEC Plus, which is a big international monopoly, should be also, managed in proper way. So human domain. I think that this is the worst, because we need to conduct our influence operations to change attitude of Russian population and Russian elites toward this war. We need to prepare them for acceptance of the future failure, for future defeat of Russia. Otherwise, we will have years of stupid and meaningless confrontation and bloody war in Ukraine. And I think that right now, after 1 year of the war, you still have some leaders who are just scared of idea that Putin regime should be changed. But in the end, we will have another government in Russia, which should accept international order, Ukrainian independence, and territorial integrity. And this is the final goal of this war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleksandr. Appreciate it. Our next speaker is Brian Mefford, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center based in Kiev. He was named by the Kiev Post as one of the 20 most influential expatriates in Ukraine. He is the owner and founder of Wooden Horse Strategies, a government relations and strategic communications firm based in Kiev.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, Oleksandr has addressed the cybersecurity side of it. I'm going to address more of the disinformation side of the war. Having a political background most of my life, I've been working in disinformation, and in politics, if a message is working, you keep using that message, and that's essentially what Russia's doing. That being said, though, Russia has taken disinformation to new lows. I would say new heights, but these are actually new lows during this war. And let's face it, they're really good at it, and they've been good at it going back to communist times, or even czarist times, for that matter. There's a story about a little old lady who went to church every Sunday, and fine, upstanding lady. She always had something nice to say about everybody. And you know how it is. There's always some punk kids hanging around, and it kind of irritates them because Mrs. Smith is always so kind and nice, and they're talking to each other after church one Sunday that their parents drug them to, obviously. And they're saying, I bet you a candy bar I could get Mrs. Smith to say something bad about somebody. And the other kid says, no, that'll never happen. It's impossible. She's just the nicest little old lady. So the punk kid goes up to Mrs. Smith and he says, hey, Mrs. Smith, what do you think about the devil? She pauses and thinks for a minute. She says, well, he sure does work hard. So, and with regard to Russia, they sure do work hard. You got to give them that. I mean, they are working 24/7 on disinformation. There was a RAND report from 2016 that called it the fire hose of falsehoods from Russia. History is going to study a lot of things about this war, but the disinformation element of it is going to be one of the key parts of what has happened, and one of the things that has to be tackled going forward to make sure that we in the West don't become susceptible to the disinformation that's out there. Like I said, Russia's been really good at disinformation for a long time. I see Andrew Fink here. He reminded me of a time when he went to the National Library of Kyiv, and he was doing his PhD work on disinformation, and he wanted to look up Beria, as in Stalin's KGB chief. Except the encyclopedia he found was from the late 1950s, so it had the longest section on Berlin and the Bering Strait, but no Beria, not a single mention of Beria. And so the Russians have been good at hiding what they don't want revealed, as well as blurring and confusing the public on other issues. From 2016 to 2019, Dr. Oleksiy Saprun was the Minister of Health of Ukraine. Had the opportunity to work for her to help with her political advisory. One of the things that we had done early on, we realized, was with her being an American-born doctor of Ukrainian descent, she became an immediate lightning rod for Russian media. And one of the things that we had to do right away was on her social media page, is we assigned a person to full-time, we called it troll patrol, because immediately everything she'd post, there would be somebody up there. It would either be profanity or, Dr. Death, or all this kind of ridiculous, these monikers and anti-American stuff, anti-Ukrainian stuff, and so on and so forth. So we basically, one of the duties that we assigned early on to one of the staff members was, your job is to follow the Facebook page and ban and delete, every Russian troll that comes on there. It turned out to be a full-time job. Eventually it got better, and we kind of culled the following, and then she ended up, obviously, as if you follow Ukrainian social media, having quite an effective social media channel, which became a useful communication channel for helping to transform Ukraine's healthcare system into the system that it is today. In the West, we ask the question, what is truth? right? That's the fundamental, what's true, what's the truth in our justice system, or what's the truth that we believe in. The current Russian government, they ask a different question. They say, they ask the question, how can we distort the truth? It's not what is truth, but how can we distort the truth? And it's a very different mentality. And, it reminds me of the screw tape letters and C.S. Lewis, right? The devil's there basically to confuse people and to make them doubt what they believe and what they know to be true. This war is different because we are getting all the information in real time. I mean, it used to be, having lived in Ukraine, for example, during the Orange Revolution, you would get a text message and it would be from somebody and you had to decide, is this real information or not, right? And there wouldn't be any way to verify it for maybe hours or days. Is it true or not? Are the Russian tanks moving on Kyiv or this and that? This is a very different time. Even Euromaidan, it's different from Euromaidan because now what's happening on the battlefield is up on Twitter within an hour, maybe 2 hours, even sometimes less. Yesterday, I contacted a friend in the Ukrainian military intelligence unit, and I had asked for some few ideas on what to say today. And he said, "Well, how soon do you need it?" And I said, "Well, I'm speaking tomorrow at 2, so I guess we got about 20 hours." He's like, "Oh, okay, good, because I'm a little busy right now. I'm in Bakhmut." And I said, "Well, it's not that urgent, right? I mean, you take care of yourself first." But because of cell phones, we're communicating with people on the front lines of combat, and information's out in the public domain. If you just have to go out there and find it. Now, the problem comes in, of course, in terms of figuring out what is truth, right? What is real, and what can be verified. Ukrainians have done, I would say, an exceptional job, having been, at war since 2014. They understand quite well, what is truth and what's real. Early on in the war, people were getting text messages, the invasion's coming today, it's this and that, and trying to stir up fear and concern, all that sort of thing. And then, Ukrainians were cool as a cucumber about it because they've been listening to this Russian propaganda for so long, that they know if there's going to be a war, it's not going to be because I got a text message about it, right? We as Americans need to do a much better job, frankly, of determining and vetting our sources of information. One of the things that Russia has done quite effectively is they have studied how we as Americans get our news, right? So they during the Cold War, it was the left that was very susceptible to being useful idiots for Soviet propaganda. Now, unfortunately, it's the right, and we see that a lot of these Russian narratives, people. Let me say too, there are a lot of people on the right. They're not paid by Russia, or none of that, but they are getting their news from sources which is contaminated with Russian disinformation. And so that's even gotten into some, the Russians have even targeted some of the churches in the States. So, you got to give it to them in terms of they're trying to press every single button to undermine Ukraine and to push Russian narratives. Oftentimes with disinformation, the goal is two or threefold. It's the old thing of throw it up on the wall and see what sticks. And if you take, for example, back in September, everyone was talking about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear station, right? And is it going to blow up? Are the Russians going to blow it up? Is it going to be a nuclear accident? What's going to happen with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear station? And that, of course, was part of the plan. But Russia also had other plans because Zaporizhzhia supplies 25% of Ukraine's electricity, or did, until it was disconnected from the Ukrainian grid. Because Russia's goal was, they knew in October they're going to be making attacks on infrastructure. And by taking out 25% of the electricity supply, they were setting the stage for that. But they did it under very clever guise of nuclear Ukraine, Chernobyl. Russia's the only country that can handle nukes. So it was a very clever disinformation campaign. And a lot of people, of course, in the West, oh, thank God, oof, Zaporizhia didn't explode in nuclear fire. That's great. And I give that as an example. Usually there are multiple motives to the disinformation that Russia's running. So they have the big story, but underneath there's usually 2 or 3 other objectives that they wish to accomplish. Now we see the Sergei Lavrov charm offensive that Stephen Blank mentioned earlier, going through Africa and talking about Ukraine's war and, gosh, those horrible Ukrainians they're not getting the grain supply because they just keep fighting, they're so aggressive. And unfortunately it's working, even though, for example, the West gives 10 times more aid to these African nations. You can look at the ones that voted against Ukraine at the United Nations last week. We give 10 times more aid than Russia does, but they're buying the Russian narrative. So when Russia meets a wall, they go around to the back door, they find another way around, or they try to climb over the wall. So their persistence is, I would say, admirable. Unfortunately, a lot of people are still falling for these sorts of disinformation. Now we see the other big disinformation wave, blank check. Of course, it's not a blank check. I always want to ask people when they say, why are we giving Ukraine a blank check? And I said, let me ask you, what would it be worth to you to make Russia a non-threatening state? Is it worth $100? Yeah, 1,000, million, 10 million? Yeah. What's the price? Frankly, so we're at 100 billion in support for Ukraine. I think it's a pretty good investment. Milton Bearden, who was the CIA station chief in Afghanistan during the Cold War, he said that the U.S. spent $13 trillion to win the Cold War. I think that was money well spent. So if we're looking at 13 trillion and 100 billion, that's peanuts for the Pentagon. And I think it's a wise investment. But you're going to see more of the blank check narrative out there as disinformation. You're going to hear the word stalemate popping up a lot more. Nazis, although they haven't gotten much traction on the Nazi stuff, corruption, and you'll see them targeting more Zelensky personally rather than Ukraine. And generally, Americans have stood with Ukraine throughout because everyone is generally sympathetic. But it's much easier to hate a person, and if a person's a comedian, not everyone's going to like his jokes, right? So it's easier to target a person than it is a country. So those are some things that will be coming, and you'll be hearing more and more, unfortunately, in the media about as part of the Russian disinformation efforts. In short, Ukrainians are quite adept and agile at spotting Russian disinformation. They're pretty solid on what they believe and what they know to be true. They're experiencing it firsthand. We as Americans need to do a much, much better job of vetting our news sources, defining, what is truth and where's this news coming from. So, thank you.
Brian, thank you very much. A couple more examples of exploitation of the electromagnetic spectrum that are relevant in this war. One is Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system. It is fundamentally crucial to the command and control network for Ukraine's military. Some Ukrainian military leaders say they couldn't fight the way they fight without access to the Starlink system. Starlink involves low Earth orbit satellites, but very large numbers of them. Another aspect is NATO is sharing information on potential targets. NATO is not suggesting specific targets to the Ukrainians, but if Ukraine wants information on targets, NATO is sharing it. And you may have read in the media, one Ukrainian military officer saying, as soon as we get the information, we fire the HIMARS, and we never fire the HIMARS without that kind of information. So that real-time intelligence is critical. NATO has airborne warning and control aircraft called AWACS, use airplanes with the radar antenna on top. They fly only in NATO airspace, so Poland, Slovakia, Romania. They don't fly over Ukraine, but they can see hundreds of miles into Ukraine and can provide information on aerial and some land assets that Russia's may have. The West collects cyber signatures of that Russia from Russian electronic assets, and may collect those signatures. There's a bank of those signatures, and so the West can provide Ukraine, probably is providing, don't know, access to signature information that helps Ukraine deal with some of its attacks, because the West will have signatures and will have patches for those signatures. And then Makiivka, it was a discussion about cyber. You'll recall on January 1st, the Ukrainians attacked, I think with HIMARS, a Russian temporary housing facility in Makiivka, and there were reports of hundreds of Russian soldiers being killed, and Russians claimed that it was because soldiers were improperly calling their families on New Year's Day with cell phones, and so the Ukrainians targeted. It's not clear that that was the motivation, but again, another area in which exploiting the electromagnetic spectrum has been critically important to Ukraine. So we have a time for questions for Oleksandr or Brian. Sir.
Hey, Brian, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I was with Brian in Ukraine as an observer a number of years ago. All right. Another point on the disinformation campaign, perhaps you could comment on. There was an article on January 27th about a journalist with Kremlin ties burning the Quran in Sweden in order to dethrone or disembark Sweden's and Finland's trajectory into NATO. Perhaps you could comment on those kinds of disinformation operations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic Russian doozy. You know, that's you know, the idea obviously is to keep Turkey from approving Sweden's NATO membership. So they created the story about the burning of the Quran in Sweden, which then would presumably give Erdogan, who's, let's say he's not, well, don't want to question another man's faith, but let's say he's probably not a stellar example of devout Islam, right? Let's say that. That being said, it gives him domestic cover to, you know, to hold up this the Swedish NATO membership. I mean, in reality, I'm sure it'll get worked out, but it creates domestic problems for Erdogan to have to explain to his voters as he's looking at an election on the horizon as well. You know, why are we approving Sweden and NATO if they're burning the Quran? They're hostile towards us. So again, you got to give it credit to the Russians. They're spending extra time like thinking about all these things. There was another situation. I was in The Hague in November 2021. I was talking to the Ukrainian acting ambassador, and she was saying we're just under constant attack. The Russians are just sitting up at night thinking of ways to, you know, to sabotage things, to change the narrative. She'd showed me a magazine. It's called Diplomat Magazine in The Hague, and it was the Russian ambassador, and had invited 5 or 6 European ambassadors over, and they made a photo unsuspectingly, right? And he's got a big bottle of Masandra wine. And they're drinking this Crimean wine because they wanted to send a message that, you know, Crimea is Russia. And so when they're sitting up at nights thinking about, okay, let's get that image in a magazine that goes to the other diplomats, you know, they're definitely working overtime, but that's all the more reason why we have to be on our toes.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Microphone.
Going to the electronic warfare. Have you seen the use of high-powered microwave systems by the Russians to take down drones? And was the Ukrainian Delta system hacked at any point?
Oleksandr, do you know the answer to the Delta attack or HPM?
So obviously, Russians are pretty capable in tactical EW, and this is not new. I think that it's kind of really, peer-to-peer contested environment confrontation, because Ukraine is also very good in that historically. I would say that our ability to intercept and jam, and conduct different forms of signal intelligence, honestly not equal, but actually pretty close to what Russia can do. And obviously, with Western support, it's one of the areas in which we probably strategically have that superiority. So at the same time, especially if we talk about not that, purposes by guys in the trenches, but talking about some little bit more, ambitious and art UAVs, even, I mean, that UAVs which are used for coordination of long-range artillery or for long-range attacks on Russian capabilities on the distance of about like 30, 50, 70 and more kilometers from the line of contact. Despite it is possible to jam that UAVs, but obviously neither Ukraine nor Russia capabilities to detect that kind of drones, and to jam and intercept them. At the same time, I have to admit that on that long-term missions for both ISR missions and for like suicide drones attacks, you don't use any communication. So in most of the cases, these drones are they don't have any communication with operators at all. They are programmed before, and very often they use mechanical, forms of targeting and guidance rather than even GPS. So this is another very important aspect, which again, I think not so well known in the US and in other NATO countries, because your experience with UAVs was mostly in the areas in which you had as your enemies people with very limited, technical capabilities, and that's why, if you had, any kind of UAVs, you wouldn't expect them to be jammed. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Yaroslav Pilinski, Fulbright scholar from Ukraine. I have a question to Brian. So, few blocks from this place, there is a monument of one of the most famous Russians, a slave trader, slave owner, a man who glorified the imperial Russia, a man whose name was and poetry was used by Putin's regime as an ideological weapon. Do you think this is a part of disinformation campaign, first? And second, if yes, do you think how long the statue will decorate the crossroad just not far from Gelman Library? Thank you very much.
Well, in recent years, I think in the US, we have been taking stock of different monuments and statues that we have to different people and reassessing, are these still needed? So if we're in the business of creating out different monuments, then I think that would be one on my list. But I mean, obviously, I guess it would fall under the jurisdiction of whether the city of DC and or is it under the Interior Ministry? I don't know. Anyway, that would be something open for consideration, though. And I think in a time when we are reassessing which statues and monuments of who we want to glorify, that would be a good one to put on the top of the list.
Unfortunately, the Taras Shevchenko monument is in probably one of the very best places in Washington, D.C. Questions? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Katerina Odarchenko. I have a question about tools fighting with disinformation. Because if we talking about Russian work here, it's also potential intervention to next presidential elections, which they use. We know that they use some tools to do influence on the last elections, and many scientific people here have big works about that. So what tools you use to fight this disinformation tools as trolls, as some opinion leaders, bloggers, which Russians use here in US, and what tool you will recommend not only for Ukrainians, but also for people in Central Asia, which we previously mentioned, also trying to be not under Russian influence, like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or other countries which now in bad situation near Russia and China. So we'll appreciate this advices about tools fighting with disinformation. Thank you.
Well, I think with Central Asia, I mean, that's obviously an area that, you know, their attitudes towards Ukraine at the start of the war, or pre-war, I should say, are different from where they are now. I think everyone has had a very sobering, you know, shock of they could be next, particularly Kazakhstan. You know, when you talk to people from Kazakhstan, they're, you know, it's a dynamic country. Things are changing, young population, and it obviously has the resources to be you know, a great power. The struggle, of course, is that, you know, are they going to align with the West? They're going to continue to align with Russia. Are they going to be aligned with China? This is the great game, as they was said 100 years ago, more than that. So, you know, for Central Asia particularly, it's more giving people more access to Western influencers, right? And more interaction with the West. Because it's so far away, they're often forgotten. And I don't think most Americans can name any of the stands or Capitol or anything like that. So we need to do a better job at the US of, you know, outreach to Central Asia. And I think Ukrainians, you know, post-war, when they're not preoccupied with defending their country, can certainly be at the forefront of that because you know, of the fact that you can communicate in Russian, you have a shared similar backgrounds and these sorts of things. So Ukrainians would actually be the perfect, let's say, evangelist for the democratization of Central Asia.
Some years ago, the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, created a new program, Current Time, in Russian, which is aimed at Russian-speaking people in non-Russian republics. There was concern that after the Cold War ended, there was a lot of political pressure for broadcasting to specific countries, whether it's Ukraine or Kazakhstan or others, that broadcasting should be in the native language, if you will. But what happened was that Russian speakers ended up watching more Russian television, especially attractive because of entertainment programming in the evening. And so it left them more vulnerable to propaganda. So a correction has been made, but that the amount of programming that Current Time does it pales in comparison with what Russian television shows in its entertainment and news program. So it's a severe problem still.
Ambassador, if I may, I would love to add a couple of words to that. So I think that an example of how Russian strategic influence works in the US and how creative they are in using their assets. So you definitely remember that lady who did for Green Party on the last presidential election. So she's very active right now in campaigning against military aid from the US to Ukraine, together with some other, notorious American politicians. But what is also important to mention that she was among that people who were using that green agenda, attacking the idea that Canada should produce more oil and gas. So that's exactly, what I was trying to say in my first speech. I think that we need to be focused on what is important and what is strategic. And right now, I think that the issue of our ability to reduce Russian income, is so critically important that we can see that Russia is using all of the possible solving this problem. Thank you.
Let's take one more question and then we'll have a small break before the next panel. Walter.
I'm just gonna two parts of probably the same question. To Mr. Danylyuk, our question. We've been noticing all day, both whether it's land or sea or air, and now in cyberspace, we're beginning to notice that the Russians aren't quite as good as everybody advertised them to be. Is that a correct assessment? We were threatened with the fact that cyber war would shut down all the internets and everything in Ukraine. And even with Elon Musk's intervention, that wouldn't go on for very long. And yet it didn't happen. So is cyber warfare something that they've not completely mastered, and that in fact we're better, the Ukrainians are better at it than they are? The second question turns to Brian. Brian, is it possible, man, that ironically, when it comes to disinformation or information, that the Russians, and Ariel Cohen, who will be here later on the screen, has talked about this, that they've actually done that much better than we could have anticipated. And they're still, that the disinformation campaign is, in the Southern Hemisphere is making a real impact. And there are places, and India and China are reacting to a lot of the things that the Russians do. Is it that they're better at it, and that they're Russia today in the English language around the world, in Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa and so on, has made a real impact, and we haven't noticed that? So those are two questions. One, about cyber warfare, that it may be less strong than we thought, and information warfare that may be stronger than we thought. Okay.
Under information.
Sure. And the answer is yes. Russia's actually quite, quite good at it. They're making their grounds through the kind of in this Cold War times, it was non-aligned nations, and so they're making some inroads in Latin America and Africa, certainly with India, China. And the thing about it is it's like whack-a-mole. You stop one narrative here, and then it pops up, another one pops up here, another one pops up here. And so their persistence is quite astonishing. I mean, they don't get traction, then they'll just try to recycle it again in 6 months, or do some other variation, some spin on a certain narrative. So again, I think we need to take stock as a country in terms of how we combat that. We need to be much more attentive to vetting sources of news, so that Russian disinformation does not contaminate our news streams, which is clearly the case and something that's happened frequently. So
it's important not to overestimate Russian capabilities. Remember, Russia started out alleging that this was a Nazi regime in Ukraine, and that narrative basically failed and has become much less prominent now. With regard to cyber, again, I don't know this, but let's just imagine that the West, the United States, are providing information on signatures and patches for signals that they have seen over globally, if you will, over a period of time, to Ukraine to help them in the cyber area. And so Ukraine could be doing as well as it is solely because of its own efforts, but perhaps also with some help. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for our panelists, and you have a short break. You have 9 minutes until the next panel. Brian, thanks a lot.
Hey, thank you, Investor. Thank you.
Sure.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen.
Well, sorry, we missed our Mr. Costello.
Yeah, well, I misunderstood his question, but anyway.
So you're in Kiev full time?
Yeah, I was, well, I keep an apartment in Warsaw too, just to kind of be in and out. And that's the airport hub now, so, getting to the west, but yeah.
Do you know Oleksiy history?
Sure, yeah. And,
She's my stepdaughter.
Right. I remember, yes. And, so know her from Davos and Ukrainian West and all those sorts of things. So.
Yeah, she was.